Hey, welcome to my channel. So in today's video, we're going to explore the topic of, does the Bible teach sexism? So the question is not about sexist stories in the Bible. The question is, does the Bible teach sexism? Does God or do the writers of the Bible teach sexism? So the Bible was written in a sexist culture, and some people in the Bible acted very sexist, right? We hear stories of polygamy, prostitution, rape, adultery, and other sexual crimes against women. However, the Old Testament has many doctrines established to protect women in vulnerable situations because God knew these situations were inevitable. For example, Moses gave laws to protect women in the event of divorce, right? Divorce was prohibited in ancient Israel, but God knew it would happen despite this. So he handed down laws to protect women in that scenario. In fact, Israelite men had to prove their right to seek divorce. They couldn't just demand it. And Jesus reiterates this in the book of Matthew. Matthew 9:18-9. Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." Rape was also prohibited in daily living as well as in times of war. The latter we'll discuss later. These laws can be found in the book of Deuteronomy, and I highly suggest you read it, right? Deuteronomy 22:25-26. "But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death," right? So the Bible wasn't written about the Israelites because they were perfect, right? It wasn't written about them because they were righteous. It wasn't written about them to glorify them. It was written to show how the ancient Israelites struggled in their faith. It was written to chronicle their highs and lows as they followed the law given to them by God. Most importantly, it was written to show that they needed Jesus, right? They weren't strong enough or faithful enough to follow the laws of Moses. They needed something better than the law. They needed Jesus. So God chose the Israelites because they were a small and weak nation. He chose them because they would only be glorified through his power and his influence. He would either make them a great nation or allow them to fall into the hands of their enemies, right? And they were great at times, and they fell at times. And quite honestly, most of their history chronicles their failure to follow God's law. With that out of the way, let's begin. So a general consensus among the secular culture is that the Bible is sexist, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote the book The Great Gatsby. And in this book, the main female character, Daisy Buchanan, said this about her daughter: "I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool." So is that what the Bible has to say about the position of women? Is this God's opinion and his will for women? Is it a woman's role to be ornamental and decorative, I like that word, and not to be heard, right? Right now, we're part of a culture that is in an uproar over this very sentiment, right? Women not only feel unheard, but they also feel unseen. And although I'm not a woman, I have a wife, I have daughters, I have sisters, right? I hear about the struggles and the very real emotions and hurts that come with it. And in a culture dominated by social media, these struggles are elevated by a 24-hour exposure. I'm going to list 2 reasons why I believe, despite what culture says, that the Bible has good news and has always had good news for women. So number 1, only God can ground the intrinsic worth of every human being. So if you take God out of the picture from a purely naturalistic perspective, it's hard to justify how you feel when a total stranger is brutalized or murdered, right? You watch the news and you can't help but feel terrible when bad things happen to other people, or you can't help but feel mad when an injustice is committed against someone, right? As a country, we were collectively outraged when Russia invaded the Ukraine, right? It had nothing to do with most of us. Most of us didn't come from the Ukraine. We didn't have family or friends in the Ukraine, but we were still outraged, right? If our lives are just cosmic evolutionary accidents, if we're nothing more than a collection of atoms, then on what basis do we assign value or significance to another person? let alone equal value. We talk about human rights, but what are we grounding them on, right? If we're just dancing to the beat of our own DNA and the name of the game is truly survival of the fittest, then why shouldn't we say that one life is of greater value than another? The Bible tells us such a different kind of story, and it starts in the very first page, right? Before we're told anything else about who we are as human beings, we are told we are created in the image of God, Genesis 1:27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them, right? According to the Bible and Christianity, we're not random, right? Our creation is intentional. We're not an accident or a coincidence, right? We are made. Not only are we made by God, but we're made like God in his likeness. According to verse 27, that applies to both male and female, right? And this may not seem remarkable, but let's compare it to other ancient beliefs, right? Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher born sometime between 423 and 428 BC. He is heralded as an innovator of the written dialogue and dialectic forms in philosophy. And this is what he had to say about the value of women. It is only males who are created directly by gods and are given souls. Those who live rightly return to the stars, but those who are cowards may with reason be supposed to have changed into the nature of women in second generation. So according to this, men alone are created by the gods, and the punishment for cowardice is that those men will be reborn as women. In radical contrast to this, the Bible asserts that not only are women as fully human as men, but they are also created in the likeness of God. Therefore, they hold equal value for him. The equality that some people are longing so much for is ultimately grounded in the very God they so often reject, right? There's simply no other statement of gender equality like this in the ancient world or the world today, right? The world shaping impact of this statement has had on the world shaping impact of this the world shaping impact that this statement has had on history cannot be overstated. In response to this declaration of equality, the early church ended the Greco-Roman practice of exposure. This was the killing of newborn infants by abandoning them in the streets within 8 days of their birth if the family felt as though they couldn't support them. And this practice not only devalued human life in general, but it was disproportionate to females because they were considered to have the greatest strain on family resources. This declaration of equality and human value also makes sense of why we instinctually grieve when something bad happens to people we do and do not know. And at the same time, if the teachings of Christianity about human value are true, then nothing that happens to us can strip us of our dignity or make us less than, right? Our worth is never going to be defined by anything that we've done or by anything that's been done to us, because we are made in the likeness of God. It is God alone who grounds our value. 2, it is God alone who guarantees justice, right? Many people who don't believe in God identify as moral relativists, but strangely, they're committed to fighting social injustice. So how do you reconcile these competing ideologies, right? If you believe there's no such thing as right and wrong, then why do you care so much about making things right in the world? We live in a culture that is increasingly rejecting the moral absolutes that uphold justice, and yet it seems that people are quicker than ever to point the finger at God and accuse him of being unjust and immoral, particularly in his treatment of vulnerable people such as women. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, it's not hard to see why people feel that way, right? If you read the Old Testament, then you definitely have been shocked by some of the stories in it, right? As an ancient historical record, it intentionally describes both the highs and extreme lows of human behavior. It doesn't hesitate to tell stories that are distressing and quite morally reprehensible, right? Stories that include rape, polygamy, incest, female oppression, and violence against women. However, instead of being surprised by this, we should ask ourselves why. Right? How often do we treat the Bible as uncomfortable or awkward? We read a story, assume the absolute worst, and then condemn it. Not only do we condemn it, but we run away from it and never look back. We don't take the time to try and understand what is going on in the story, right? We read the Old Testament, we're reading historical accounts from a world and a culture that is vastly different from our own. And this means that when we read the Bible, we have to work hard to understand its history, its culture, and its purpose. We have to work hard to understand its context, but when we do, these stories begin to make sense. So let's start with a couple of very troubling passages. Deuteronomy 21 deals with the treatment of female prisoners of war. So Deuteronomy 21:10 through 14. When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you are not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. So when you first read through this verse, this passage, it seems disturbing. But what is it actually saying? The first thing we read is that the Bible is giving detailed instructions on how to preserve and protect the lives of vulnerable women during a volatile time. The second thing is that, unlike many surrounding cultures where women were considered to be spoils of war, rape is banned in ancient Israel. It actually carries a death sentence, and I explained that earlier. It says that if a man desires a female captive, he has to wait a full month after the battle to ensure that his desire isn't just temporary lust, and to give her the proper amount of time to mourn her losses. Shaving her head, trimming her nails, and setting aside her clothing from the war, these are simply hygienic observations set aside to protect the household from any communicable illnesses or infestations such as lice, right? The ancient Israelites had very strict codes of hygiene that protected the house as well as the community. The clothes worn before and during the war were probably torn, ragged, and possibly stained with blood. It wouldn't be hygienic or even comfortable for the woman in question to keep wearing them after her capture. So after this time, the man is permitted to have her as his wife only if he commits to marrying her. Now notice the verbiage. After the time, the man is permitted to have her. It doesn't say the man gets her. It doesn't say the man takes her forcefully. It doesn't say the man takes her against her will. It says the man is permitted to have her. And permitted to have her not as a sexual slave, not as a spoil of war, as a belonging, as a piece of merchandise. He is permitted to have her as his wife only if he commits to marrying her, right? Only if he commits to marrying her, meaning he can't engage in a sexual relationship with her outside of marriage, right? There's no verbiage in the law forcing the captive woman to marry the man. It is her choice, right? If the man chooses to marry her and she to marry him, she is welcomed into the community as a full family member instead of being a second-class citizen. If he decides not to marry her, she cannot be sold as a slave or treated as a slave, right? He has to set her free. Now let's compare that with something in our modern day history. So in December of 2014, the Islamic State issued a decree to its soldiers on how they were to treat female prisoners of war. It was called Questions and Answers on Female Slaves and Their Freedom. The decree states that the soldiers are permitted to have sex with a female prisoner immediately after her capture. She becomes his sexual slave, and with that, he can either sell her or give her as a gift if he doesn't want her. Even more horrifying is that sex is permitted with female prisoners even if they haven't reached puberty. And this is 2014. This is not the first century, the second century, the third century. This is 9 years ago. So in light of this, I'm highly encouraged when I read how God displays his mercy and compassion when he decrees how female prisoners should be treated in Deuteronomy 21, right? These two decrees couldn't be more different. Deuteronomy was written to protect the vulnerabilities of female prisoners of war, to humanize them in the most volatile moment of their lives. And we find another example in the book of Judges, chapter 19 through 20. And these passages have been classified as texts of terror by many feminist commentators. And I'm not going to beat around the bush, right? I'm not going to try to tell you anything different. This story is horrifying, and what happens in it is truly horrifying. And I'm not going to try to beat around the bush or paint it as anything else other than truly disgusting and horrifying. The story is about, and you can read it yourself, I'm just going to paraphrase it. The story is about an Israelite man from the tribe of Levi who comes to a house that is surrounded by a mob of violent men who want to rape him. In a cowardly move to save his own life, he offers up his concubine instead. She is raped and brutalized the entire night and left for dead on the doorstep. The Levite wakes in the morning to find her dead and decides to dismember her body. He then sends the pieces out to the other tribes of Israel, calling upon them to take vengeance for her rape and murder. And this results in a bloody battle between tribes that kills thousands of men. Now, this is utterly horrifying, and there are so many ethical problems here, right? Not just the cowardice of the Levite, but the crime itself. Not just the cowardice of the Levite or the crime itself, but how the Israelites responded to it all. The response falls so short of obtaining justice for the murdered woman that they even fail to hold the Levite accountable for his act of cowardice, which caused it all. Rather than running away from this horrible and tragic story or covering it up, the Bible exposes it. The Bible puts it out there for you to read. Why? Why does the Bible expose such a horrible truth that serves the history of the Israelites no purpose? Because this story is written as a fierce indictment against a people who have turned away from God and are now only doing what they think is right, in their own eyes. And when people ask, how could this story be in the Bible? Your response should be, how could it not be? It's a public record of the undeniable statement that even though her rapist didn't see her as a person, even though the Levite didn't see or treat her as valuable, and even though the huge overreaction of the Israelites failed to bring her any degree of justice, God did not allow her to go unseen. Right? He puts her story front and center by immortalizing it in Scripture. He ensures that the story will be read and remembered so that even thousands of years later, we are still talking about it and mourning its tragic outcome. God not only confronts us with the horrendous reality of what happens when a culture does whatever it thinks, but he demands that by remembering such a story, we don't go and do the same thing again. And this is not a religious cover-up, right? It serves as a stark reminder of why we need an all-seeing God to bring justice. Genesis 16:13. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I now see the one who sees me. And this is a prayer to God by Hagar, an Egyptian slave of Abram and Sarah. They would later be named Abraham and Sarah. In this story, Hagar is ordered to sleep with Abraham because Sarah is barren. Now keep in mind, this is after the Lord has promised Sarah that she would become pregnant, right? The Lord had come to Abram previously. They were both like, Abram was like 101 and Sarah was like 98. And God had said, I'm going to give you a son. And, Abram was like, okay. And Sarah had become impatient with the fulfillment of the promise, right? She had expected God to give her a baby immediately, except God takes years. He takes years to give her a baby. So Sarah is barren, and she wants a baby more than anything because that's what she's been promised. So Hagar's pregnancy ultimately makes her fiercely jealous, and she begins to mistreat Hagar. And as a result of this, Hagar flees because She's scared that both her and her child will be murdered by a jealous Sarai. So the angel of the Lord went to Hagar and made her promises, and because of those promises, she felt heard and seen by God. Genesis 16:10. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will become too numerous to count. So God not only recognizes women as victims of injustice, he also empowers women to work on his behalf. We have the prophet Deborah in the book of Judges, who almost 3,000 years ago was appointed to be the judge of the nation of Israel, right? This is 3,000 years before Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed as the first female judge to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1981. So not only did she secure several military victories for Israel, but she also ushered in a 40-year period of peace. In a world that has all too often overlooked women, God sees things differently, right? He sees women as indispensable, not disposable, far from painting them as beautiful little fools. The Bible celebrates women who have the courage to act, to save the lives of others at the risk of their own. Women are praised for their entrepreneurial spirit and their financial savvy, right? Women who take the initiative to establish justice where it has been overlooked. Women are praised for their wisdom even when their husbands make foolish decisions, right? Women who have the spiritual authority to challenge kings and speak on behalf of God. However, by the 1st century AD, attitudes towards women in Jewish culture had actually become more oppressive rather than less. And this is the world and the culture that Jesus grew up in, right? Josephus, a 1st century Jewish Roman historian, noted, the women, says the law, in all things, or the woman, says the law, in all things is inferior. Yet despite this, Jesus treats women with the utmost respect. And one of the things I love about the New Testament is that Jesus never tells women they're beautiful, they're just beautiful little fools. Far from it, right? Just for example, there was a 1st century belief that women were much more susceptible to sexual temptation than men. Therefore, to catch sight of a beautiful woman was to find yourself in grave danger. It was in this culture that Jesus preaches his Sermon on the Mount and completely turns these cultural assumptions upside down, right? Matthew 5:27 through 28. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart, right? Here Jesus is teaching the exact opposite of what his culture taught by challenging his followers to recognize that lust originates within the heart and to take responsibility for it. He calls them to a higher standard. He calls them to see women as human beings made in his likeness and not as sexual objects. Jesus' law also lived at a time when the education of women was strongly discouraged. Yet when Martha tries to call Mary into the kitchen as she is sitting at the feet of Jesus, Jesus rebukes her. Luke 10:39 through 42. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet, listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations she had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So she's described as sitting at the feet of Jesus. And in the 1st century Jewish culture, this is a revered position for an honored disciple, right? So for her sitting at the feet of Jesus is an honorary position. It's a position of high value, right? Let's also consider that not only did God take on human flesh to come down to us, but he had a mother, right? She was so revered for her relationship with Jesus that the early church called her Theotokos, which means the God-bearer. She was the one who nurtured and protected Jesus when he was in his most vulnerable state. And there's no other act on earth that would signify the tremendous respect that God has for women than to have his one and only son born of a woman. Time and time again throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus clashing with a culture that is directly oppressive to women. What does he do? He totally overturns it. He clashes with the Pharisees and the Sadducees so often over this that they find it offensive. And a perfect example of this is the story of Mary washing the feet of Jesus at a dinner he's invited to by the Pharisees. And the best part of the story is how Jesus defends Mary and then rebukes the Pharisees or rebukes this particular Pharisee, Simon, for his lack of common congeniality and actually insulting them both. So Luke 7:37 through 38. And I'm splitting this up into two different passages. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, so she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, "If this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner." Now, this is the best part, and I know this is a lot of scripture, but this is truly important. So Luke 7:44 through 48. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, "Do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet." Now, that's important because the Jews at that time, everything was dirt. All right, there were no roads yet. Or if there were roads, they were on trading routes, right? In Roman cities. There were no roads. So you're walking around with a pair of sandals. It's windy outside, it's dusty. Your feet are going to get caked with dirt and dust. So it was common congeniality that before you entered into a house, the resident of the house would provide you with a bowl of water for you to dip your feet in. And this is what Jesus is talking about. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, which was also a general greeting of congeniality. When you went into somebody's house, it was an act of congeniality for them to give you a kiss on the cheek. I don't know if it was two kisses, one kiss, but for them, it was an acknowledgement of, I'm inviting you into my house as my friend and as my guest. Welcome. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little. Jesus said to her, your sins are forgiven. So awesome and so profound. More than anything, Jesus asks Simon and the other Pharisees, do you see this woman? Do you see her? Not as a sinner, not as a scandal, not as a scapegoat for your lust. Do you have the eyes to look beyond the labels that have been put on her and to simply see her as she is? And I believe that's the question that God is asking us. Whether it's women we're watching online or in movies and viewing them as sex objects instead of image bearers. Whether it's women in our lives who have treated us callously or failed to honor, there are certain things in our lives and certain ways that we have treated the women in our lives that God wants to change, right? When we publicly proclaim ourselves as Christians and don't value others like we should, we are actively complicit in causing them to believe lies about their worth and to believe lies about God. We are making them think that God must not value them much either. The question Jesus is asking us today is, do we see others? Do we see women like Jesus Christ sees them, right? Whatever efforts we make as human beings, whatever progress we make, it's never going to be enough, right? It's never going to be enough because our problems are much deeper than any legal, social, or political remedy, right? Nothing that we can come up with can fix how we value each other and how we value women, because our problem is the very issue that Jesus identified and addressed in the Sermon on the Mount, our hearts. The problem is the human heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a Russian writer and a Soviet dissident who publicly criticized communism and spent 11 years in a Soviet gulag, right? He summed it up best in his book, The Gulag Archipelago. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? The hard reality is that the human justice system will always fall short because no man-made system can legislate the heart. What inexpressible relief it is then that although human justice will fail us, Jesus Christ was unwavering in his commitment to the cause of divine justice. And that is exactly what his death on the cross symbolizes to us. The cross being the strongest and most overt statement that God ever made, right? The statement being that we're not okay. Our lives are in total opposition with the life that God had intended us to live. The only appropriate way to deal with this, the only righteous judgment for the ways we devalue, debase, and dehumanize others is death, right? To people who have never been the victims of gross injustice, this seems harsh, right? To those who have been the victims of unspeakable crimes, God's commitment to justice is a hope for those people to hold on to. No matter how badly wrong no matter how badly wrong they have been, the God of all earth will do what is right, right? He will ensure that justice is served. And there are many of us who have been treated badly, and that matters to God, right? Deeply matters to him. But before I go, I want to leave you with the names of influential women in the Bible I didn't have time to list or tell you stories. Now, mind you, these are just a few. There are so many more. So Shiphrah and Puah, these are the Egyptian midwives who protected Moses as a baby after being found by the Pharaoh's daughter. Miriam, she was the older sister of Moses and a prophetess who had a hand in saving Moses as well. Rahab, she was a prostitute in the city of Jericho who harbored 2 Israelite spies and saved them from the king's messengers. Ruth, she was a Moabite woman who married an Israelite man. After her husband and 2 sons died, she remained and cared for her mother-in-law despite risking abject poverty. Esther, she was a Persian queen who saved the entire nation of Israel after a treacherous plot to kill them by the king's advisor, Haman. Mary Magdalene, I'm going to go a little bit deeper on this one. She was a follower of Jesus who traveled with him, witnessed his crucifixion, burial, and resurrection, right? If women are of no importance to God, if the Bible teaches us sexism, why was Mary Magdalene with a group of 2 to 3 other women, why were women the first ones to discover the resurrection of Jesus? Right? Because in the first century, and I explained this in another video I have, evidence for the resurrection. In the first century, women couldn't be witnesses. Women had no rights in a court of law, right? For instance, their testimony was illegitimate, non-legitimate, right? If a woman saw a crime, she wouldn't be brought to court to give a statement, to give a witness statement, because her statement wasn't considered to be worth anything. So that being said, why would God allow 3 women to be the first ones to witness the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Why? If women have no value, why would they be the first ones to witness the most awesome act in history, the act that launched Christianity? The resurrection is the act that launched Christianity. Without the resurrection, Jesus would have died, been dead, and the apostles would have went back to fishing, tent making, whatever, and that would have been the end of it. But God put it on the hearts of 3 women, in the eyes of 3 women, to see the resurrection and to go report it. I mean, that's just so powerful, so powerful. Rachel, a woman who was deceived by her own father when the man she was engaged to was tricked into marrying her sister. Hannah, a woman who prayed desperately for a son, promising that she would deliver him to the priesthood when he came of age. Abigail, a woman who saved her family and all they owned from her stubborn and wicked husband after he defied David before David became king. So that's just a few. You can find so many others. You can find a lot more others in the New Testament. Women helped to fund the ministry of Jesus, right? Jesus didn't work. I mean, his ministry was his work, but we never hear or see Jesus doing any physical work because his work was his ministry, and women were influential in funding his ministry. Without women, Jesus could not have just administered to people for 3.5 years. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been fruitful for you. And if it was, please subscribe. Have a blessed day. Thank you.